Well, Matt, thanks for finally making it in studio here. A little bit of a car drive flight for you from the UK.
Yeah, it's been a good journey, but no, glad to be here and the sun is shining, which is always good.
You and I were chatting at dinner last night. The weather in the UK has been less than optimal.
Yeah, we have this sport called cricket, and it's meant to be played in sunshine, and whenever the cricket season starts, it's rainy, it's wet, and it is. So, yeah, when I drove up from Miami, it was nice. I could see why you're based there. It's lovely.
Yeah. So IQ Endo, you and I met each other a number of years ago when you were over at Proximity helping Nadine build that organization.
Yeah.
And then I remember the phone call that we had, and you're like, Joe, I'm heading out, and I'm going to go do my own thing.
Yeah.
When you told it to me, I was like, I'm going to be watching, and here we are today.
Yeah, that was a tough decision to make, actually. Really tough call because, we'd built Proximity. Proximity is Nadine's business, and I'd helped scale it with her, and it really felt like I was probably leaving the party early. But sometimes when you see an opportunity to, do your own thing, be the CEO that you want to be, and build the business that you want to be around a healthcare that you're really passionate about, you've got to take it. So it was a tough decision, but yeah, it's so great to see Proximity doing well.
Yeah. And so let's jump into IQ Endo. Give me the thesis of the organization, give me the thesis of the technology, and then where are we going?
Yeah, so the thesis is really about single-use disposable endoscopy, but specifically for GI, so for gastroscopy and colonoscopy, which is 75% of the world's endoscopy volumes. So the heritage or the genesis of the company was founded by an endoscopist in the UK called Patrick Ward-Booth, who had set up community endoscopy. So the move of moving patients from the acute setting into the community setting for rapid diagnosis and screening. He built a really successful endoscopy practice that was sold to a big strategic, and he sat back at the end and thought, right, what have I learned from that? And one thing was around, in the UK and Europe, the inefficiency of decontamination, and actually how can you treat more patients with the capacity coming through. So he sat down and said, right, if you can make a single-use endoscope which looks like a reusable, functions like a reusable, but at a lower cost, you've got a business. He teamed up with a chief technology officer called Andrew Miller, who's from the automotive industry, and a plastic or a materials expert, particularly around polymers. And so that clinical view combined with the automation, modular, how do you build a product at volume, at scale, at a low cost? So specific modularization of builds, as we see in cars, with really clever things you can do around the polymers was how it came together. And that's what I looked and said, right, I can understand where the endoscopy problem is and where this is needed. And there was a couple of founders that really had, the clinical piece and the materials piece together, and it was quite inspiring.
Yeah, and you've assembled a pretty darn good team there, starting from yourselves, obviously, and chairman. He's got a little bit of experience as well.
Yeah, so we got the first seed. So Patrick and Andrew started the company about 2017, spent 3 years with friends and family money trying to get the prototype right. And then I came on board in 2020 and we raised the first seed fund from Creo. We had a strategic investor in Creo Medical. So they're in endoscopy anyway with speedboat technology for ESD. We're funded by the Development Bank of Wales, so through the Welsh Government, and some high-value individual investors. I was taking some counsel as well in my own journey from Martin Frost. So I knew Martin from the CMR surgical days, real champion of UK Medtech, and what a phenomenal journey he's been on. We became friends from previous roles, and I was getting some mentorship from him or just some advice on how to build it through. And I think we might have done something okay because he's now come on board as chairman. So he's leading the board now, which is really phenomenal. And if we can create another organization like CMR Surgical, we'll have done okay.
Yeah. And it's funny, CMR has become, as well as Proximity and a few others, become poster children of what is possible out of the UK medtech, health tech ecosystem.
Yeah.
Maybe I've just stopped, I didn't start looking until about a half a dozen years ago, but why the sudden blitz coming out from the UK on these technologies coming over to the US?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, we're quite a small nation, but we like to say we punch above our weight as well. But we have a really phenomenal public health service and a private health service, and some of the best surgeons and clinicians in the world are based in the UK. What we're seeing is underpinned by a very strong academic setup with some of our universities and creations, and a lot of the early technologies were university spin-outs. And it's becoming there, and there's multiple examples now where a technology has been built at university, spun out through corporate ventures, and then built through. And we've got a phenomenal seeding ground with our hospital base, both public and private, to actually bring these inventions to life. And you'll see in any clinical show, some of the best practices are in the US and in the UK and the US that they work together. So we're quite small in terms of a population, but it's that it's a phenomenal hospital or healthcare system underpinned by, really clever projects coming out of universities and ideas, and it's quite well funded as well.
And it's interesting because I get this visual when you start to say that. So, obviously the universities in the UK are some of the best in the world.
Yeah.
But I think what finally happened was you had all these technologies and all these ideas that in the past were white papers that just sort of came up with the concept, came up with the thesis, and then the sheet of paper went into the desk and never came out.
Yeah.
Until the venture capitalists
Yeah.
or the vulture capitalists were sitting there waiting, going, wait a second, do you have something? And they've started to mine the university
Yeah.
and the academics finally in the UK.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there was a program run by Tony Young on the clinical entrepreneur side. So there's been investment and focus to say, actually, how can we take some of these ideas and make sure it's not just a clinical paper or a PhD thesis or something? How do we turn this into a concept? You have Proximy was a clinical entrepreneur program. Innovus, Elliot's company there, was through that. Touch Surgery was through that as well. So there's been a real focus on that from, probably from governmental level to say, how do we break this out? Exactly to your point. Don't leave it on paper. How do we turn these into organizations? Because fundamentally, I speak for myself, it's not about running a company. It's about developing a new technology that will change healthcare for the better. And that's what we're trying to do. And so many good ideas have just been left on paper. And now it's about turning them into organizations.
Now, and there's a really good digital talent pool in the UK that seems to be the underpinning to a lot of these technologies.
Yeah, absolutely. You've got that through. There's a talent pool. Education systems are strong. COVID accelerated that as well. And there's also a shift away. A lot of people in the UK are not risk averse. They're willing to make that jump and actually come out of the safe corporate, strategic world or, big corporate world into a startup. It's not as, people are willing to make that jump, and they're the people that you need.
Well, the Brits always love a good fight.
We do.
You just have to attend the football match and you know what goes on.
Well, there's a lot of history, isn't there?
So let's dive into IQ Endo. So when you and I have been chatting about the platform, certainly the single-use visualization market is really become frothy. I think last count, it's got to be at least 35 to 38 new players. Now, all different approaches, of course, and subtle market differences. But nonetheless, we've never seen a rush to a market like this unless you go back to the structural heart days when you had 40, 50 companies, maybe the insanity of surgical robotics. But it's really interesting now how many single use are going after that. Why do you think that there's a itch to be scratched there?
So what we're seeing is the cause for it or the reason behind it is probably different in different geographies. So maybe I'll just talk about what we're seeing in the UK and Europe. So within endoscopy, we're all living longer. We've got an aging population. There's a preference for endoscopic technologies, and there's increased screening programs in most major countries. But from the age of 45 to 50 now, you'll be screened in some way for early detection of cancer. All of that together is meaning that more and more people are picking up early signs, and at the minute, if you have an early symptom, you go straight for an endoscopy. So you can see the volumes. Some analysts are saying global volumes will move from 70 million to 140 million. Whether it's that jump or not, but definitely there'll be over 100 million procedures, across the year moving forward. And the industry itself is dominated by some phenomenal organizations, big camera companies with great products, and it's a complex world, and they are super technologies. But they've got some limitations in terms of the numbers that they can be used on, the reliance on decontamination, reprocessing. And when we look at the patient throughput coming in the UK, our endoscopy rooms are already working at 5-7 days a week, 12 hours a day, and they're waiting on the scopes to come backward and forward from decontamination or reprocessing. And if you then have more people waiting at the door to come in, supply can't meet demand. And that's now where single use has started to get real traction. And it's been proven through in bronchoscopy, cystoscopy, uteroscopy, some of the probably safer grounds to start with because they tend to be two-axis planes. It's not as complicated as GI, but they've got a foothold in showing that it's there. So it's not that single use will in the short term replace reusable. That's not going to happen. But there's a capacity issue which is creating a supply and demand challenge. And unfortunately, with reusable endoscopes, they are reliant on decontamination and reprocessing. One thing we have in UK and Europe, which is probably slightly different to over here, is you don't always have decontamination on site. You might have a shared facility in a region. So your scopes are moving in lorries, in trucks, from the point of use to the reprocessing back again, and you need them at a certain point back on that list. Around about 20% of the time, they might come back broken or with parts missing or not back at all. And so then you could be sat around waiting, but I can't do the endoscopy without the scope. So what we're seeing over the last few years, and COVID really accelerated it, is that supply and demand challenge, which is creating a backlog. And how can we move patients who don't need anesthesia with more simple procedures away from the endoscopy suite into other parts of the hospital or the community to have a more diverse point of care?
And so that's an interesting angle, because when you think about the US market over-indexes towards sterilization, square footage required, changing centers of cares into ASCs, the best image at every single time versus getting third, fourth, fifth generation before it gets clean processed. So what's your timing on US market, just generally, versus the UK market? And I have watched over my decades, when you have a business that has to have different business models based on geographies, it can become very complex.
It can. So I think the big point there for us is when we look at the FDA and the regulators, so when we look at the regulators in the market, FDA seem to be encouraging the move to single use, but it's very much from a cross-contamination point of view. That is noted in Europe and the UK for sure, but it's not the issue that's causing the change. So probably the main driver over here is slightly different. It is that cross-contamination, and there's more and more approvals coming through from the regulatory bodies to help that. I think what is important for any new technology, if you're dropping a new technology like single use into the massive market of endoscopy, which is dominated by phenomenal companies with phenomenal technology, you've got to really understand the problem that you're solving. And when you think you found what the problem is, you then prove it through data. And you say, right, let's work the data. How's this working? What are the economics there? Because if I'm bringing in a single-use endoscope and it's going to save some decontamination time or reprocessing, well, how much is that? So what is the bit of data that is funding or the foundation to your problem that you're solving? And then that's your model that you work on. But if you put that product in, so it could be regulated, single-use endoscopes tend to be a Class 2A device through a 510K approval process. It's the structure. There's a structure to work through. So it's not, you're not doing de novo. You can structure your business to work through that process with the FDA, and they're great at collaborative working. But your issue would be okay, you might have your product regulated, but if you try and go too wide too soon and it doesn't work, you can kill that market before it starts. So what we're seeing in the two different markets, our common point is we have to understand the problem that we're solving. It might be the same problem, might be slightly different, but the data sets have got to line up, and then you can bring your product on the back of that.
So you have to make at least an assumption on what you're going to measure.
Yeah.
Right? So it sounds like you might measure a different data point, at least for a starting data point, in the UK market than perhaps the US market, because it's a capacity issue in the UK potentially. Yeah. You mentioned something earlier. One of the founders came out of automotive, and I love to unpack this because we tend to get a cognitive entrenchment as Medtech, this is the way it's got to be a Medtech person. These are the processes, don't deviate from that. And then you bring in some outside talent, I call them conspicuous outsiders.
Right.
And so how are you looking at the market differently from a manufacturing, supply chain, polymer, material perspective that if not but for this person joined the team?
Yeah, so what Andrew's bringing, which is really important, when we look at, when I go back to when I heard the opportunity about single-use endoscopy and did want to, help lead a business there and build it, I looked at what are going to be the things that will stop this being successful. So the first thing for single use is you've got to get the product right. Okay, let's presume the product is good. Then it is going to be, if the demand takes off, you've got to be able to manufacture it at scale. And that's then around industrialization of your supply chain, industrialization of your manufacturing. Can you get automation or semi-automation through it? So it was that sort of background that you look, somebody from the car industry, when we all spec a new car, you start with your chassis, what wheels do I want, what tires do I want, how do I build it through, what's inside? And it's done on that sort of part. So we look at, the joy of being a startup as well as smaller companies, you can look at the right people and the experience they bring. And it doesn't have to be from medtech, but you have a skill set that you need or a way of thinking. You do need some people from medtech because they've got, there's a path you need to follow, so you need that experience. But anybody with a different skill set or a different industry brings so much more value into it. And certainly on our manufacturing side or operations side, the big challenge for us now, we feel we've got a really good product, which is coming through regulation. It's looking to be straightforward. It's actually then the stability of that supply chain and the efficiency of that manufacturing. And what Andrew has managed to do is build the product in a platform or modular way. Then even now we know what the here and now needs to look like, but even the future, we've got to make that product easy for other technologies to drop in without having to go right back to the start of design. So, he really was a testament of that different experience in that industry, bringing it in. He's got a bit of a learning on medtech, but you partner that with, the right people from the right industries with the right thought processes, and that makes you a stronger organization.
One of the things that I always want to know, and I learned from is, as a CEO steps into a new role, he or she steps into it and says, okay, got it, understand the entire proposition, know the roadmap, know where it's going, know the user, got it, yep, this makes sense. What did you not forecast? And you're not allowed to say COVID. What did you not forecast when you took the role of CEO? And what is this market more of, and what is this market less of on this single-use visualization, if you had to think it through?
Yeah, so I look at it firstly, yes, the role of CEO, you are ultimately the leader, but you don't have to make every decision, and it's not about you. It's not about you as a person. So you build a team of people around you who know more than you do in those expertise, and you galvanize an environment that their expertise shine through, and they lead the pieces that they need to. And I certainly found, as a CEO coming into a group of founders, there were 3 founders. Well, they don't suddenly become not important. They are still important. And actually my role was to still galvanize those, because it was their early vision, and they were onto something. So you make sure you bring it through. So I think when we look at building IQ endoscopes, it really is not one person is going to ultimately lead the company or be the only person. You build that team around you, give everyone the space and the autonomy to execute at what they're good at, with communication and collaboration, that everyone's working together. And your role becomes a ringleader, juggling those through, and also translating that message from the board into the exec team, into operations, but funding it through. And I think, what did I not know? I was fairly convinced that they had worked out the ergonomics, that their concept was great. We knew that imaging would be a continual development. Our image system is pretty good, but imaging is not binary. It needs to always get better. It has to be the underpin that always gets better. So that was there. I think the piece I learned really quickly is you keep everyone on board, and you bring the right people in with the right experience. And the other part now growing, which we didn't know would be so important 6 years ago, is the sustainability. So it's in a normal medical device company, you work out from my concept to my supply chain, how am I making the product? How am I then sterilizing it? How am I moving it through to distribution? How am I creating a demand? And you get to usage. Right. And once it's used, you focus on billing. Okay, how do I get the money for it? We've now got to focus on what happens after that. And that's the piece now, which is as important as the
and that becomes an enormous service play. Other single-use visualization systems, I'm listening to them and like, well, we've got an entire, Amazon-type approach. We've got an entire process and service on the back end of reclaiming all that. We then have to solve the problem of sort of reprocessing, and maybe not the entire system is disposable. Part of it is, yep. And then that becomes an entire business in itself outside of getting that product into the user's hands.
Yeah, and it's a really interesting question. So how is that done? When you look at it, does that cost ultimately go onto the product, and then it becomes a cost of goods? And that changes your economical forecast for your organization and the working capital and how much margin might be there. And that's one. Or do you create another organization that deals with that? And then there are organizations in the US and Europe that are collecting used medical devices, scopes as well, contaminated scopes, almost like needle stick, sharps retrieval. Well, if they're picking up the scope, why aren't they picking up everything else? So that whole piece is being worked out at the minute. And it's easy to say we're going to do it. Working out how you're going to do it, And also, if you're really telling the true story, don't move the sustainability problem from the hospital just to another area that they're not seeing. You've still got to do something good with that, which means it's not being incinerated or it's not being put into landfill.
Or shipped off to another country in a barge,
Absolutely.
and it's out of sight, out of mind.
That's the thing. So, I'm sure someone might try that,
Right.
but actually for us, that's not the ethical thing to do. You have to show, and where we want to get to actually on sustainability is showing the full, a full audit of where are all the components going, what's happening to them. Final point on that, you have to stay true though to the point that you have been regulated as a single-use device.
Which becomes a complex problem to solve if part of your device is not single-use.
Yeah, and there are new entrants on the market now who've got everything reusable up to the handpiece and then a different insertion tube, whether you're doing a duodenoscopy, a cholangiogram, a colonoscopy, they've got that. The issue there for me, and it's great technology and I'd never speak badly about it, but you've still got fluid pathways which could go from patient to patient and could cause cross-contamination. So, what are they solving? It's a question.
Yeah. So as I compare the single-use to the classic reusable, what are the competitive differences, performance differences, pro and con on both sides as you put them up against each other?
So where we look at it, an endoscopist, endoscopy is a high volume, relatively stable reimbursed procedure that normally makes profit for the provider or for the establishment it's being done in. And endoscopists are spending their time looking at a screen, and moving the scope through. So you have to, it's about muscle memory of them using it. And so the first thing, if you're going to bring a new technology in, it's actually not the difference to reusable, it's the similarity. Can it look and feel the same? There was an acquisition back in 2016 or 17 of the self-driving colonoscope, which ultimately we've not seen it on market yet, but it had a much different handpiece, much different control. So it's not really the differences, it's actually can you drive firstly the similarities in the ergonomic performance. When someone picks it up, they shouldn't have to read an instruction manual, it should just be away we go, I know how to use this. Look at the handpiece, yep, 2 buttons, biopsy channel, 2 wheels.
That's what I'm used to, that's what my workflow is, that's what my team
exactly.
knows,
It
right?
feels the same.
Yeah.
What you do after it is different. So it's actually not the differences, it's the similarities we can drive, and that's where we've focused a lot of our time. I think the elephant in the room with single use, and if we've got to call it out, is the image systems. The big companies, Fuji, Olympus, Stryker, everyone there, they're camera companies. Pentax, they're camera companies. So how can single-use technology provide the same image? And that is going to be something that's going to be really interesting to follow over the next few years. So camera technology will get better. The lens technology, the CMOS, the power, the machine learning algorithms on the back will get better. Going back to your question, what are the similarities or major differences? Well, the first similarity for us is it looks like, it feels like, and it works like a reusable. So we've spent a lot of time on the weight, a lot of time on the ergonomics of the handpiece. And it's like the Henry Ford, we're trying to make it look like the current state of the art in the market, not infringing on any IP, clean designs and single use there. And then the other piece behind it is, yes, reprocessing is not great for the environment either. There's a sustainability issue there. There's bleaches, there's chemicals, there's PPE, there's electricity, there's carbon dioxide. It's a complex process. But what do you do at the end of a single use scope? That is a challenge as well. So there are similarities, there are differences, but you've got to give the endoscopist the experience that they're not actually changing their practice or they're not changing their workflows because those workflows are so efficient.
And that's interesting because the pushback I get oftentimes in the early days of the single-use scope was it doesn't feel, the same weight isn't there, the same balance in my hand isn't there. And so you've really addressed that, it sounds like.
We're trying to. Yeah. I wouldn't say we're there. I think the key to it, though, is we go back to how do you launch a new technology into a market? It's not, single use is not ready for every procedure. So choose your procedures. So it goes back to that. What's the problem you're solving? What's the data? Okay, in a diagnostic patient flow, a screening patient flow, interventional, therapeutic, which indications would this be suitable for? And start there. And you build your confidence with your user base. Don't try and, the worst thing we've seen, we've done it all through our careers, and we've seen other companies, trying to oversell your product for volume, and you end up in procedures it's not it's not needed for, and it won't work. And I think I'd say, to our organization, to any other organization coming out in single use, it's let's not kill the belief, let's not kill that concept, because it is still fragile. There's a reason that endoscopy hasn't been massively disrupted over the last 20 years, because it works really well. So, what we're looking at is what is that procedural volume that makes sense for single use? Plant it in there, seed it. You've got your theoretical data before, you've got your actual data during, get that model right. And then as the technology gets better, as confidence increases, you can start pushing it into different procedures. So, we don't see, we're not coming out with our single use in the US saying it will replace reusable. It won't. It will have its place to start with. But if you kill that market too quickly, if you try and go too hard for procedures it's not needed in, it will.
Yeah, and it'll create a one-way street oftentimes for future adoption and utilization, because you and I both know, we've been at those conferences, DDW, SDTS, is, yep, tried it, didn't work for me, and that becomes viral as well. It can positively of, yeah, it's good. Imaging's not as good, but gosh, it's solving my problem of capacity.
Yeah.
Right? I could now have these procedures take place in an alternate place outside of a hospital.
Yep.
I can stack them, I can turn them around and maybe 2x my throughput on a daily basis.
Yeah.
Right, so I think that's important. And you, as a leader of a single-use visualization company, I'm assuming that the other 38 of you or 40 of you should be caucusing with each other along the lines of, listen, let's not screw it up for each other. Let's get it right, because if you have one bad actor or two bad actors in that category, they could potentially take the legs out of that category or really delay its adoption.
Yeah, so when I first started in this role, one of my first phone conversations with the CEO of of Ambu, who are already established in that market, and we chatted together. And it's a friendly conversation, which is, look, we're here, this is what we're doing. We might fight against each other, to create that market. But the first thing we have to do, we might fight against each other to win the market, but the first thing we have to do is create it together. And in there, it's, we can't disclose what each other are doing. There's no collaboration there, but there are some certain things that we should have through our ethos, and one major one is sustainability. I went around DDW. There are now some new entrants from other regions coming into the gastro market that we're in. So the other, multiple providers are normally in bronchoscopy, cystoscopy, uteroscopy. Ambu, ourselves, are probably the two names now coming into the gastro and colon market. Ambu are already there with a phenomenal product. But we need to make sure that we do it well. We control those market dynamics together. And I'm not talking about controlling price or anything like that. It's more, we're just sensible about adoption rates. And as you say, don't ruin it for each other. Let's create the market first that we can then, go and work on together. And the bit we see, product right, optics right, pricing right, health economics right, the sustainability is the big piece we've all got to get right.
So as you move into your next phase, can we talk a little bit about financing? Can we talk a little bit about what you think that's going to be timing-wise and what you hope to accomplish with each of the rounds?
Yeah, so we've done a seed round, an A round, and a B round, and we just completed that in December. We've got two tracks of product. Our first gastroscope, which was only meant to be a prototype, was clinically pretty good, and that's going through regulation at the minute so that we have a product that we could put into some early centres. We're on the final 30 days with the FDA and going through the UK regulation as well, so we'll see that piece. But our main go-to-market product, which is clinically great, and with a phenomenal cost of goods and back-end assembly and manufacture, that is going into what we call transfer to manufacture later this year. So we'll be raising some more money to help us complete the regulatory process. We've had an interesting journey, which is actually raising, we've raised £12 million over £12 million, so $50 million maybe, over the last 3 years to incrementally grow so that we're continually in control of what we're doing. Sometimes everyone says, I wish I had more money. If you have too much money, you try and do too many things.
And you're forced to do things too quick because your investors like spend it, spend it, spend it.
So we've got an interesting dynamic coming up, which is we need to raise another round, probably towards the end of this year, to fund that transfer to manufacture. And then there'll be commercialization after that. So does this round take us to commercialization, or just before, or just in? Where is that? So we'll be raising some more money at the end of this year. I think in reality, it'll be to fund that transfer to manufacture. It'll be to fund the regulatory process, and then we'll have a bigger round for commercialization.
So I love the discipline of that and the confidence of that, because oftentimes we usually go for these large tranches and say, we're always fundraising. How much more, please?
Yeah.
And forgetting about valuations and forgetting about dilution. But I find it forces you and maybe an unhealthy way, to live to timelines versus this is where we ought to be right now on again, decisions. Because I see that oftentimes is, if I'm giving you money to invest, I'm going to push your timeline regardless.
Yeah.
And sometimes you bring that cake to the table when it needed to cook a little longer, and you learn something tremendously different that when you extend that downrange longitudinally, you end up in an entirely different place.
Yeah. And yeah, it's a great point, and it's something we think about a lot. So you've got your, so what we've done, which has worked well, you know, I'm not saying it's the perfect model, it's worked for us. We have a board who are super engaged in what we're doing. We've got the great balance between a strategic investor, an institutional investor, a venture capitalist firm on there, and we are, you know, we're working really hard together around it. Transparency is key. So you're raising money to get to a certain milestone, which will have a value inflector around it, and you need to do X, Y, and Z. But you also need enough in the bank in case it goes wrong. But you also have to allow yourself a pathway to be agile still, because you know there isn't the playbook yet of 5 single-use companies who've made it to global. You know, the playbook's not there. So you have to be able to be committed to your, you know, path, which gives confidence on, yep, these people are saying they're doing what they said they would. They've executed that. We keep coming in there. Each smaller, you know, a couple of smaller rounds is not a big, you know, drop for them. But at the same point, you are always fundraising. And it's that balance between fundraising while still making sure your operational business is going the right way. So, you know, we're working that through at the minute.
It's very exciting times, and I love these conversations you and I always have, because this is a market that needs to be discussed thoroughly, because we're still feeling our way through it.
Yeah.
And to your point, there's a lot of players in it. There's a room for a lot of players, and I don't think it's a small pie that everybody's fighting for. I think it's an expanding pie, for sure. Over the years. So there's going to have to be patience with it and tenure with it. But this was a great session. More of these needed. I've been trying to get a round table of you and maybe 3 of your quote unquote slightly overlapping competitors just to talk about this. Because I don't think the market understands this market.
No. Yeah, it would be, as I say, it would be great to do that.
So we'll have to do that. I have to reach out to a couple of my friends out there. You know who I'm talking to. So expect a call from Nicole pretty soon. So, well, thank you, my friend. I always appreciate it.
Thank you. It's been great to be here.
Enjoy the weather until you go back to the wet, cold UK.
I put the sun in my bag and I'll be taking it back for everyone. Thanks, Joe.
You can always port it over. Well, I'm Joe Mullings from 160 Studios. Be well.